There are ships that changed history. There are ships that became legends. The Bismarck, the Yamato, the Missouri. And then there is a ship that didn't exist, yet still went to war. This is the story of the most secretive naval project in the history of the Soviet Union. It is about a battleship built under conditions of absolute secrecy, intended to shift the balance of power across the world's oceans. A ship that never once tasted open water. Officially, it was a failure. The most expensive blunder in the history of Soviet shipbuilding. 15 ships planned, 0 completed. But the official version is only half the truth. Because this ship did fight. Its armor stopped the enemy. Its guns killed. Its legacy lives on to this day, just not in the way anyone had planned. And there is a question that military historians still cannot settle. What would have happened if they had finished it in time? An encounter with the Tirpitz in the Barents Sea, the siege of Leningrad, the Cold War. The answers lie ahead. And the last one is the most unexpected. In the autumn of 1941, near Leningrad, German artillery opened fire on Soviet positions. The shells landed with precision, casualties mounted by the hour. German commanders were certain. One more push and the defensive line would collapse. Then something flew back at them. A shell weighing nearly a ton. A projectile like that doesn't just kill people. It erases everything within a radius of several dozen meters from the face of the earth. German observers didn't immediately realize what had happened. Then they began counting the craters. In the staff headquarters, a question arose. Where did this come from? It was a 406mm gun, the main battery of a battleship. But there was no battleship in Leningrad. There couldn't be. The Baltic fleet was trapped in the harbor, hiding from the Luftwaffe. So, what was it? This is where the story begins, a story you have likely never heard. This gun was created for a ship that didn't exist, for the most ambitious naval project in Soviet history, for a battleship that was meant to be the symbol of a new maritime superpower, and which never once reached the high seas. Its armor was stripped from the slipways and bolted into bunkers on the outskirts of Leningrad. Its guns fired at the enemy from the shore, mounted on railway platforms. Its hull, the part that fell into German hands, could neither be finished nor destroyed, nor even properly used by them. The ship fought, just not as planned. Think about that for a second. A battleship that was never a battleship defended a city during the most horrific siege of the 20th century. Not at sea, on land. Not as a whole, but as armor and iron, cut into pieces. Its name was the Sovetsky Soyuz, the Soviet Union. Today, we will break down this entire history, from the first blueprint to the final explosion. We will talk about what kind of ship it was meant to be, why they didn't finish it in time, and what would have happened if they had. But first, we need to understand the world in which it was conceived. A world where steel decided everything. A world where every nation on the planet was feverishly forging as much of that steel as possible. The mid-1930s. Picture the map of the world. In Japanese shipyards, 2 ships are being laid down under such secrecy that almost no one knows of their existence. They will be the largest warships in human history, the Yamato and the Musashi. Each is nearly 70,000 tons of steel. Their guns are 460mm. A single shell weighs 1.5 tons, the weight of an average car, flying at the speed of sound. In Britain, the King George V is launched. In Germany, the Bismarck is nearing completion. In Italy, the Littorio. In France, the Richelieu. In America, they are laying down the Iowa class. 4 ships, each longer than 3 football fields. The whole world is building battleships, and it isn't an accident. In 1922, the major naval powers signed the Washington Naval Treaty. The goal was simple: limit the naval arms race before it led to another war. They set limits on displacement, gun caliber, and the number of ships. For 14 years, it more or less worked. In 1936, it all collapsed. Japan and Italy announced they no longer considered themselves bound by the treaty. They simply walked away. The rest of the world realized the game was over. If Japan builds whatever it wants, why should we limit ourselves? England, France, and the USA began designing new ships, free from restrictions. This wasn't just an arms race, it was a signal. When nations stop negotiating about weapons, they start using them. Historians would later call this moment one of the first loud precursors to the Second World War. But back in 1936, most people just watched the news and hoped it would blow over. It didn't. In Moscow, this was understood very well. At that time, the Soviet Union did not have a single modern battleship. The fleet was in a pitiful state. Outdated ships from the Tsarist era that had survived the Revolution and the Civil War, but had long since become scrap metal with guns. After a diplomatic conflict with Britain in 1927, it became clear. Without a strong fleet, the country was vulnerable. The Baltic, the Black Sea, the Arctic, the Pacific, 4 theaters of war, and all of them were empty. In 1936, Stalin approved the Big Fleet Construction Program. Pay attention here. The plan was to build 15 battleships, not 2 like Germany, not 4 like America. 15 super dreadnoughts for the Baltic, the Black Sea, the North, and the Pacific. When Western naval experts heard of these plans, some thought it was mere propaganda. It was too incredible. It wasn't propaganda. It was an order. Now, Soviet engineers faced a task that was breathtaking, and not in a good way. Russia hadn't built ships of this class for 2 decades. The school of design had been lost. Specialists had died, immigrated, or been executed during the purges. The necessary factories didn't exist. The slipways didn't exist. Cranes with the required lifting capacity didn't exist. Almost everything had to be created from scratch. And so, they began. The White Sea, the mouth of the Nikolskoye branch of the northern Dvina River. There is nothing here, literally nothing. A few fishing huts, wooden walkways over the water, endless forest to the horizon. In winter, the temperature drops to 40 degrees below zero. In summer, the midges are so thick that people wrap their faces in rags. This is where the Soviet government decided to send tens of thousands of workers. It was here, on this empty shore, that a factory capable of building the largest ships in the country's history was to rise. Why here? The logic was ironclad. In the event of war, the Baltic and Black Seas could be blocked almost instantly. The straits are easy to close. The Pacific was too far. But the White Sea opens into the Barents, and from there to the open ocean. Strategically, it was perfect. From a construction standpoint, it was hell. The first workers arrived in the summer of 1936. They set up a tent camp in the woods and started felling trees. There were no roads, no electricity, no proper housing. Tools were brought in by barges on the river. Many of the workers were prisoners. The Gulag was actively used for projects of this scale. Others were volunteers, promised high wages and housing. The housing didn't appear for a long time. Neither did the wages. In 3 years, a city rose from nothing. They named it Molotovsk, after Vyacheslav Molotov. Today, that city is called Severodvinsk, and the factory built there is Sevmash. Today, it is the main shipyard for Russian nuclear submarines. But then, it was built for entirely different ships. 2 massive docks, enormous, nearly 300 meters long each, as wide as a major street. Special slipways designed for hulls weighing tens of thousands of tons. Cranes capable of lifting sections weighing hundreds of tons. Cranes that had never existed in Russia before. They were designed from scratch. Soviet engineers learned on the fly. But the shipyard was only the beginning. Think about what a battleship is made of. Armor, guns, machinery, turbines, gearboxes, shafts, propellers, optics, electronics, fire control systems. Every one of these elements required a separate production line, and almost none of them existed at the required scale in the USSR. Armor. A battleship doesn't just need thick steel. It needs special cemented armor capable of withstanding a hit from a main battery shell. Such armor hadn't been produced in Russia since the Tsarist days. The Azora plant near Leningrad was tasked with mastering its production. Engineers studied captured samples, restored lost technologies, and conducted tests. How long did it take? Several years. And even then, by the start of the war, armor of the necessary quality was still being produced in insufficient quantities. Guns. 406 millimeters, the main caliber of the Sovetsky Soyuz. Russia had never made such cannons. The Barricadi plant in Stalingrad was ordered to develop the weapon from scratch. A special design bureau, new machines, new technologies for forging barrels of such diameter. A prototype, just one, was ready in 1940. One. And each battleship needed 9 of these guns. Multiply that by 15 ships. This raises a question that Soviet planners apparently didn't ask loudly enough. Will we have time? There was another problem that was the hardest to solve. People. Engineers. Designers who knew how to project ships of such size. In 1917, during the Revolution and Civil War, many specialists had immigrated. Others had died. Others, and this must be said plainly, were executed or sent to camps during the years of repression. Among the victims of the Industrial Party affair in 1930 were naval engineers. The Soviet leadership found a way out: buy the knowledge abroad. A delegation of Soviet specialists went to Italy. The firm Ansaldo, one of Europe's leading shipbuilding concerns, agreed to cooperate. The Italians shared blueprints, consulted Soviet engineers, and helped with calculations. This cooperation was very fruitful and very short-lived. When Mussolini entered the war on Hitler's side, the Italian specialists went home, right in the middle of the work. All this time, in Leningrad, Nikolaev, and Severodvinsk, work continued on the master design document, Project 23, the blueprint for the ship that was supposed to change the balance of power on the seas. Boris Grigorievich Chilikhin was appointed chief designer. He was in his early 40s. He had no experience designing ships of this class. No one in the USSR did. He learned as he went. His team did the same. And you know what? They succeeded. The technical project was approved on May 13, 1939. On paper, the Sovetsky Soyuz looked terrifying. Imagine you were given a task: build the most powerful warship to ever sail Soviet waters. No finished blueprints. No foreign instructors on hand. No precedent. From zero. That is how Boris Chilikhin began. He was 40 when he was named chief designer of Project 23. Short, neat, with a habit of speaking softly and slowly. So much so that people involuntarily leaned forward to hear him. Colleagues recalled that he never raised his voice, even when everything went wrong. And things went wrong often. His team worked under conditions that could hardly be called comfortable. Constant pressure from above. Faster, faster, faster. The threat of repression hung in the air. Engineers were arrested for sabotage if the project dragged on, or if calculation errors were found. Several of Chilikhin's colleagues went through interrogations. Some never returned. And yet, on May 13, 1939, the project was approved. Let's look at what they created. Hull length, 269 meters. That's longer than 2.5 football fields. Width, 38 meters. Draft, over 10 meters. Standard displacement, 59,000 tons. Full displacement, about 65,000 tons. For comparison, the Japanese Yamato was 72,000 tons full displacement. The American Iowa was about 57,000 tons. The Sovetsky Soyuz sat between them, heavier than the Iowa, but lighter than the Yamato. Not the largest ship in the world, but one of the largest. And in terms of armament, one of the most dangerous. Main battery, 9 406mm guns in 3 turrets. 3 guns each, 2 forward, 1 aft. It was for these guns that the Barricadi plant developed the B-37 cannon. Stop for a second here. 406 millimeters. That is the diameter of the barrel. Now imagine the shell that goes into it. The shell's length is nearly 1.5 meters. Weight, 1,108 kilograms. That is the weight of a small car. The gun accelerated this shell to 830 meters per second and threw it nearly 46 kilometers. 46 kilometers. If you stood in the center of a city, the guns of the Sovetsky Soyuz could hit a target beyond the city limits, past the suburbs, somewhere on a distant highway. And it wasn't just an explosion. It was total annihilation of everything within dozens of meters. Soviet engineers created this gun without foreign blueprints, without analogs, practically from scratch. A prototype passed tests in 1940. The results were deemed satisfactory. Serial production was planned for the coming years. Planned. But the main guns were only part of the picture. Secondary battery, 12 152mm guns in 6 twin turrets. This was the weapon against cruisers and destroyers, those who would try to close in for a torpedo run. Anti-aircraft, 8 100mm guns plus 32 37mm automatic cannons in quadruple mounts, against aviation. And here lies the first crack in the project. In 1939, 37mm automatics were considered sufficient AA defense. But by 1941, when the Japanese would sink the British Prince of Wales and repulse from the air, it would become clear. The AA armament of any battleship of that time was catastrophically insufficient against modern aviation. The Sovetsky Soyuz would have been no exception. Armor. The main belt was 375 millimeters. The main turrets were 495 millimeters on the face. The armored deck was 50 to 155 millimeters, depending on the zone. Designers tried to make the ship as protected as possible from artillery fire. From artillery, yes. From aerial bombs and torpedoes, that was a different question. Speed, 28 knots, just over 50 kilometers per hour. That was slower than the Iowa at 33 knots, slower than the Japanese Congo class, but comparable to the Yamato, which also wasn't known for speed. For a ship of such displacement, it was respectable. Range, 6,500 nautical miles at an economical speed of 14 knots. This was enough to sail from Murmansk to the east coast of America without refueling, or to circumnavigate Japan. Crew, about 1,700 people. A small city on the water, with its own hierarchy, its own life, its own conflicts, and its own fate, tied tightly to the fate of the ship. Now, the main question asked by everyone who studies Project 23. How did the Sovetsky Soyuz compare to the best battleships in the world? The honest answer? It would have been roughly equal to the Bismarck in firepower, and superior to it in armor protection. It was inferior to the Yamato in gun caliber, 406 millimeters versus 460 millimeters. But it had 9 guns against 9, and the rate of fire of the B-37 was higher. Against the Iowa, it's more interesting. The Iowa was 5 knots faster, which is critical in a naval battle. But the Sovetsky Soyuz was more heavily armored and had larger caliber guns. If these two ships had met in the open sea, the outcome would not have been obvious for anyone. But blueprints are one thing, iron is another. 4 ships were to embody this project in steel and rivets. 4 shipyards, 4 cities. 4 fates that turned out completely differently. July 15th, 1938. Leningrad, Baltic shipyard, morning. The smell of the river and machine oil. An official delegation stands on the slipway. Officers in white tunics, engineers in suits despite the heat, workers off to the side. They were told to be present, but kept near the gates. Speeches, applause, an orchestra. Then, the hammer strikes the commemorative plate. A bronze plaque is set into the structure of the future ship. Officially, the battleship Sovetsky Soyuz is laid down. The workers return to their posts. The labor begins. At the Baltic shipyard, preparation had been underway for months. The old slipway had been widened and reinforced. It had to support a hull weighing tens of thousands of tons. New cranes were installed. The first batches of steel were delivered. Everything looked solid. Everything looked as if the country knew what it was doing. This was only the first keel laying. 3 more followed. October 31st, 1938. Nikolaev, Shipyard 61. Communards. On the shore of the warm Black Sea, they lay down the Sovetsky Ukraina. It's warmer here than in Leningrad. October in Nikolaev feels like a northern summer. Workers work without heavy coats. The city lives by shipbuilding. The yards here were built under Catherine the Great. Tradition, pride, confidence. December 21st, 1939. Severodvinsk, Sevmash plant. December on the White Sea is a different story. Dark by 3 in the afternoon. Frost. A wind from the ocean that takes your breath away. Workers wrap themselves in sheepskin coats. On the slipway built 3 years prior on an empty shore, they lay down the Sovetskaya Rossiya. On the same day, the Sovetskaya Belorussia is laid down in the neighboring dock. 4 ships, 4 shipyards, 1 program. On paper, it looked logical. Distribute the load between different factories, build in parallel, save time. By 1946, the first series would be ready, then the next, and so on. 15 battleships. But reality began to diverge from the plan almost immediately. The first problem was steel. Armored steel for the hulls arrived late. The Azora plant near Leningrad was mastering new grades of armor. It took time. Deliveries failed. The slipways sat partially empty while waiting for metal. The second problem was equipment. Special machines for processing parts of this size were partially purchased abroad. German and American suppliers worked slowly, sometimes delaying shipments under various pretexts. War was already in the air in Europe, and not everyone wanted to sell strategic equipment to the USSR. The third problem was manpower. Skilled naval laborers were in short supply. At Sevmash, they simply didn't exist in sufficient numbers. The plant was new. People were recruited from across the country and trained on the fly. Training levels varied wildly. Some crews did brilliant work. Others had to redo theirs 3 times. And finally, the fourth problem, the most serious: money. The Big Fleet program devoured resources at a monstrous rate. Simultaneously, the country was building tanks, planes, and artillery. The military budget was huge, but not infinite. Battleships competed for resources with other programs, and they didn't always win. By 1940, it was clear. They couldn't pull 4 ships at once. In October 1940, an order was issued. Suspend the construction of the Sovetskaya Belorussia. Concentrate efforts on the Sovetsky Soyuz. Stop here. The Sovetskaya Belorussia had been laid down in December 1939. By October 1940, 10 months of work. How much had they managed to do? The ship's completion at the moment of suspension was 1%. 1%. This means they had managed to mark the slipway, lay the very first ribs, and outline the hull. Effectively, they drew the ship on the ground and stopped. Tens of thousands of rubles, hundreds of workers, months of labor, and 1%. This fact says more about the program than any official document. But even the other 3 ships progressed slower than planned. The Sovetsky Soyuz in Leningrad, the flagship of the program, given the best resources, was about 20% ready by mid-1941. The Sovetskaya Ukraina in Nikolaev, 7%. Sovetskaya Rossiya in Severodvinsk, even less. 20% in 3 years of work. The plan was to commission the ship 5 or 6 years after laying the keel. The math didn't add up. Everyone realized this, the planners, the engineers, and apparently Stalin himself. But saying it out loud was dangerous. There was one more thing they preferred not to discuss. While Soviet workers slowly assembled hulls from armored plates, the world was changing rapidly. September 1939, Germany invades Poland. April 1940, Norway, Denmark. May, France. June, Britain stands alone against a Europe under Hitler's boot. War was happening, and it was happening fast. On the slipways in Leningrad and Nikolaev, this was felt in a special way. Workers read the newspapers, they heard the radio reports, and they continued to rivet armored sheets to the hulls of ships that wouldn't be ready for many years. And then came June 22nd, 1941. All arguments about deadlines lost their meaning in a single morning. June 22nd, 1941. 4 o'clock in the morning. The border is on fire. German planes are already over Soviet territory. Tank columns are moving through Poland, through Belarus, through Ukraine. Communications are severed. Commanders don't understand what is happening. Orders contradict one another. In the first hours, the Soviet Air Force loses hundreds of planes, many right on the airfields, before they could even take off. At the Baltic plant in Leningrad, the morning begins as usual. The whistle blows. Workers go to their shift. Someone has already heard it on the radio. Something happened at the border. But work is work. On the slipway stands the hull of the Sovetsky Soyuz, nearly 200 meters of armored steel. On the hull are hundreds of workers. Welding, riveting, an ordinary day. The extraordinary day came a few hours later. By the evening of June 22nd, it was clear. This was not a border incident. This was a war. A real, total war, the likes of which had never been seen. And the first question that faced the Fleet Command was simple and terrifying. What to do with the ships on the slipways? The answer came quickly. Freeze the construction of the battleships. All resources to the front. Transfer the workers to the production of tanks, artillery, and ammunition. Clear the slipways for the repair of combat ships. 3 years of work. 20% completion. Stop. But the history of the Sovetsky Soyuz did not end there. It was just beginning its strangest and most heroic turn. Remember the B-37 gun? The single prototype of the main battery that they managed to build at the Battleship plant. 900 tons of steel. A barrel 20 meters long. A weapon created for a ship that would no longer exist. This gun was not sent to a warehouse. It was mounted on a special railway platform and sent to the Leningrad front. August 23, 1941. German troops are on the outskirts of the city. The ring of the blockade is tightening. Heavy fighting is underway in the Neva direction. The Germans are trying to break through to Lake Ladoga to finalize the siege. Soviet artillery is working at its limit. And suddenly, a shock that rattles the earth for several kilometers around. The B-37 opened fire. Imagine this scene. The railway platform stands in the forest, camouflaged with branches. Around it, the crew scurries, several dozen men. The commander looks at the map. Coordinates received. The target, German positions 30 kilometers away. For ordinary artillery, it's unreachable. For the B-37, it's a standard working distance. Fire. A shell weighing over a ton streaks into the sky on a flat trajectory. 14 seconds of flight. Then, an explosion that German observers initially mistake for an aerial bomb. Too big. Too destructive. This gun would fire at the enemy from August 23, 1941 until June 10, 1944. Almost 3 years. The Neva direction, Kolpino, the Karelian Isthmus. A cannon created for naval battles fought on land, and it fought effectively. But this was only part of how the Sovetsky Soyuz went to war without a hull. The armor. The sheets of armored steel prepared for the battleship, some already at the Baltic plant, some in the Azora warehouses. In the first months of the blockade, when defensive positions were being built at a frantic pace, this armor was literally worth its weight in gold. The sheets were cut with blowtorches, tailored to the needed sizes. They were welded into pillboxes and bunkers on the approaches to Leningrad. The armor of the battleship that never went to sea stopped German bullets and shells on the Leningrad lines. Think about that. Metal intended to protect a ship in the open ocean protected men in frozen trenches around the city. Project 23 fought, just not according to the blueprints. Now, Nikolaev. Here, the story was different, and much more bitter. In August 1941, German troops were rapidly advancing through Ukraine. Nikolaev was under threat. On the slipway of the 61 Communards plant stood the hull of the Sovetsky Ukraina, 7% completion, a giant steel structure over 100 meters long. It was impossible to evacuate. You can't put a hull like that on a platform and haul it east. It was too big, too heavy, too rooted to the slipway. It could only be abandoned or destroyed. There wasn't enough time to destroy it. Soviet units retreated. The Germans entered Nikolaev on August 16, 1941. And on the shipyard slipway, they found something that made them stop, literally. An enormous steel hull, unfinished, without superstructures, without guns, but impressive in size alone. German officers walked around it, peered inside, took photographs for reports. Then the engineers arrived. And they wrote back to Berlin something that no one in the Soviet command could have taken with anything but a bitter smirk. To finish the ship is not possible. Germany does not have equipment of the necessary power. No specialists familiar with the project. No complete set of blueprints. No armor of the required grades. The hull is too large for any German shipyard capable of taking it on. Nazi Germany, which had conquered half of Europe, seized the shipyards of France, Norway, and Holland, could do nothing with an unfinished Soviet battleship. The ship that Soviet industry couldn't finish in 3 years was equally unreachable for the industry of the Third Reich. This was a strange, bitter, but nonetheless real victory. The Germans used the hull as a warehouse. They stored equipment and supplies in its holds. They dismantled some metal structures for their own production. No finish it? No. They didn't even seriously try. In 1944, Soviet troops returned to Ukraine. The Germans retreated. Leaving Nikolaev, they blew up the slipway where the hull sat. The hull itself was damaged, partially, not critically, but enough that finishing it was out of the question. The Sovetskaya Ukraina never became a ship, but it became a witness to the fall of one empire and the resilience of another. In the north, in Severodvinsk, the hull parts of the Sovetskaya Rossiya were partially dismantled before the Germans could arrive. They never made it that far. The metal went to the war effort. By the end of the war, little remained of the 4 great battleships. A gun on a railway platform, armor in bunker walls, 2 partially dismantled hulls, and 1, in Leningrad, which survived the blockade right on the slipway, covered in camouflage nets, under bombs and shells. The war ended. Victory was won. And now, for the first time in 4 years, the Soviet leadership had time to ask the question that had been hanging in the air since 1941. What should be done with the Sovetsky Soyuz? May 1945. Victory. Berlin lies in ruins. Germany has signed the capitulation. Across the Soviet Union, tears, embraces, shots fired into the air. People flood the streets in the middle of the night simply because they can't sit at home. 4 years of war, 27 million dead, and victory. In this euphoria, few thought about the unfinished battleship on the slipway of the Baltic plant. The hull had survived the blockade. It survived the bombing. It survived hunger, cold, and 4 years of total neglect. It just stood there, enormous, rusting, covered in camouflage nets that had long since turned to rags. But the question of its fate had to be decided. In the early post-war years, a strange atmosphere reigned in Soviet naval planning. On one hand, the euphoria of victors. The USSR had emerged from the war as a great power, with a massive army and a nuclear project in full swing. On the other hand, the country lay in ruins. Hundreds of cities destroyed, industry exhausted, millions living in dugouts and barracks. Under these conditions, admirals began submitting memos about finishing the battleships. The logic was clear. The war showed that the USSR was a great power. A great power must have a great fleet. Battleships were the symbol of a great fleet. The hull already exists. The blueprints exist. The factory is standing. We just need to resume work. Stalin, surprisingly, did not object at first. In 1945 and 1946, commissions inspected the hull of the Sovetsky Soyuz, one after another. They wrote reports, they counted money, they evaluated the technical condition. The hull had been damaged during the war, corrosion, several shrapnel hits from bombings, deformation of some structures from time and stress. But overall, it was alive. It could be restored. The question was something else. What exactly were they restoring? To build the ship according to the 1939 blueprints meant commissioning a battleship that would be obsolete the moment it was finished. The world had changed radically. In December 1941, Japanese aviation sank the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse off the coast of Malaya in a few hours. Without air cover, a battleship is vulnerable. Everyone knew this. In April 1945, American aviation sank the Yamato, the largest battleship in history, before it even got close enough to Okinawa to fire a shot. 19 hits from torpedoes and bombs, 3 hours, and the ship was gone. If the Yamato couldn't protect itself from planes, what could be said for the Sovetsky Soyuz with its 1939 standard AA guns? They could modernize the project, strengthen the AA, redesign the superstructures, install new fire control systems. Soviet designers prepared several modernization variants, but every variant hit the same wall: money, time, and the main question no one wanted to ask out loud: who is this ship going to fight? Because from 1945 on, the likely enemy was obvious: the United States. And by that point, the US had 4 Iowa-class battleships. Modern, fast, with massive AA batteries and experienced crews who had fought through the Pacific. And that's not counting the aircraft carriers, of which the Americans had over 20. The Sovetsky Soyuz, even if finished, wouldn't just be inferior to an Iowa. It was fundamentally outmatched in speed, AA protection, and crew experience. The only things that surpassed the American ship in were armor and gun caliber. But in an era where the outcome of a sea battle was decided by aviation, not an artillery duel, that advantage was almost illusory. Everyone understood this, but they were afraid to say it openly. While these talks went on, the hull was launched from the slipway. The slipway was needed for other ships, less ambitious, more realistic. The hull of the Sovetsky Soyuz was anchored in the harbor. It sat there for several years, enormous, rusty, useless, yet officially still listed as a ship awaiting completion. Then, Stalin died. March 5, 1953, a date that changed much in Soviet history. Politics, economy, culture, and naval programs too. Khrushchev, who came to power, looked at battleships with undisguised irritation. He was a man of a different era, the era of rockets, nuclear weapons, and jet aviation. Enormous ships with main battery guns seemed like dinosaurs to him. Expensive, vulnerable, obsolete dinosaurs. He expressed his attitude toward the fleet directly. Once, according to the memoirs of admirals, Khrushchev said something like this during a meeting on naval construction: "Battleships are floating coffins. One missile, and the ship is gone. Why do we need floating coffins?" The admirals protested. Khrushchev didn't listen. In 1953, the decision was made. The battleship Sovetsky Soyuz would not be completed. Officially, finally, the program was closed. What to do with the hull? Here, the Soviet command showed a peculiar practicality. The hull was still quite strong. The armor was thick. Why cut it into scrap if it could be used for something? They towed it out to sea, anchored it at a point with known coordinates, and they began to shoot at it. New Soviet missile weapons needed testing. They needed real targets with real armor to understand how missiles would penetrate the defenses of warships. The hull of the Sovetsky Soyuz became the perfect testing ground. From 1953 to 1956, they fired at it. Different missiles, different ranges. They studied the damage, the armor penetration, the effectiveness of the explosives. Imagine this scene: a quiet sea, a gray sky. The enormous hull sits at anchor. No superstructure, no guns, no flag. Just a giant steel box. And a missile flies toward it. Small, swift, a trail of smoke behind it. Then, the strike. A flash. A roar of an explosion heard for many miles. And a few seconds later, silence. Only smoke over a hole in the side. This wasn't just military practice. It was something more. New weapons were literally killing the old. The missile age was executing the battleship age, physically, shot by shot, until nothing of the great design remained but riddled iron. In 1956, the hull was sent for scrap. Scrap metal. 20 years of work, dreams, and resources melted down into steel for other needs. The other hulls had long since been dismantled. Sovetskaya Belorussia on the slipway in 1940. Sovetskaya Rossiya during the war. Sovetskaya Ukraina in Nikolaev after liberation, when the hull, blown up by the Germans, was declared beyond repair. The program that was supposed to create 15 battleships created 0. Not one ship, not one broadside, not one voyage. If you look only at these numbers, it is a grand failure. The most expensive naval construction program in the country's history, ending in a total 0. But if you look wider, the picture is different. Because something remained from this program, and that something turned out to be more important than any battleship. Here is the question that haunts everyone who studies this history. What if they had made it in time? This isn't just idle curiosity. Alternate history is a tool. It allows us to understand what exactly was critical in the real events, what decided the outcome, what could have been changed, and what was impossible to change no matter what. Let's build 3 scenarios, 3 different answers to one question. And I warn you now, none of them will be simple. Before we begin, one disclaimer. Everything you hear next is alternate history, a reconstruction based on real facts, real technical characteristics, and real military doctrines of the time. But these are not facts. This is an analysis of possibilities. Keep that in mind. So, Scenario 1, the Baltic. The Sovetsky Soyuz is in service. Suppose construction had gone faster. Suppose armor deliveries weren't delayed. Italian consultants stayed longer, and planners didn't spread resources between 4 ships at once. Suppose the Sovetsky Soyuz entered service by early 1941. About 6 months before the war started. What happens next? June 1941. Germany begins Operation Barbarossa. Simultaneously, Operation Hannibal in the Baltic. The German fleet and aviation try to block the Soviet Baltic fleet in the Gulf of Finland. This is real history. Real mines, real submarines, real airstrikes. Now add a battleship to this picture. The Gulf of Finland is not the open ocean. It is shallow water, narrow fairways, islands. A ship 270 meters long with a 10-meter draft is not a weapon in these conditions. It is a target. It cannot maneuver. It cannot escape aviation. It is tied to fairways that the enemy knows by heart. The Luftwaffe in 1941 completely dominated the air over the Baltic. Ju-88s, He-111s, horizontal bombers and torpedo planes, worked with almost no opposition from Soviet fighter aviation, which had been crushed on the airfields in the first months. What happened to the Finnish coastal defense ship Väinämöinen in 1941? Soviet planes hunted it for years before finally sinking it, mistaking it for another ship and missing it repeatedly in the early years. That says something about the accuracy of Soviet aviation then. But the Luftwaffe in 1941 were not the Soviet pilots of the early war. They were experienced crews with combat time in Poland, Norway, France, and Britain. And they knew how to sink ships. Let's be honest, the Sovetsky Soyuz in the Baltic in 1941 would likely have lived for a few weeks, maybe a month or two, if the command showed extreme caution and kept the ship in harbors. But in an open fight in the Baltic, against dominant aviation, under a mine threat, without air cover, its chances would have been minimal. Remember the fate of the Murat, a Soviet battleship of pre-dreadnought design stationed in Kronstadt, September 23, 1941. German pilot Hans-Ulrich Rudel dropped a 1-ton bomb on it. A hit on the forward turret. Ammunition detonated. The bow of the ship was blown off. The Murat sank right in the harbor. The Sovetsky Soyuz would have been larger, the armor thicker, but fundamentally, it wouldn't change the situation. Scenario 1. Likely outcome. Sunk by German aviation in the first months of the war. Its guns would still have been more useful than the ship. Now, Scenario 2. This one is more interesting. The Northern Fleet. Sovetsky Soyuz versus Tirpitz. A different time, a different theater. Suppose construction was completed by 1943, which technically would have been possible under different work rates. And the ship was sent not to the Baltic, but to the north, to Murmansk, to the Barents Sea. Here, the picture is completely different. The Arctic Ocean is open space. There are no narrow guts like the Gulf of Finland. Here, a ship can maneuver. And here, a Soviet battleship would have something to do. Because here resided the main nightmare of the British and American fleets, the Tirpitz. The Tirpitz was the sister ship of the Bismarck, one of Germany's strongest battleships. In 1942-43, it sat in Norwegian fjords and tied down colossal Allied forces by the mere fact of its existence. Convoy PQ-17, remember that story? In July 1942, the mere rumor of the Tirpitz putting to sea forced the Allied convoy to scatter. German submarines and aviation sank 24 out of 35 transports. The Tirpitz itself never even left the fjord. That was its strength and its weakness. The Tirpitz almost never fought actively. It was a fleet in being. Its presence alone changed the enemy's strategy. But in an open fight, it was as vulnerable as any other battleship. Now, a meeting between the Sovetsky Soyuz and the Tirpitz in the Barents Sea. In technical specs, it's a fair fight. Tirpitz, 8 380mm guns. Sovetsky Soyuz, 9 406mm guns. Armor is comparable. Speed. Tirpitz is slightly faster, 30 knots against 28, but the difference is small. At the distance of an artillery duel, the Sovetsky Soyuz has the weight of shell advantage. 9 406mm guns versus 8 380mm means every Soviet broadside is about 20 to 25% heavier. At long range, that is critical. But here's the thing. Such a meeting almost never happened in the real war. Battleships avoided open artillery duels. It was too expensive a gamble, with too unpredictable an outcome. Both commanders in such a situation would likely have preferred to disengage. Still, strategically, a Soviet battleship in the north would change everything. The Tirpitz would no longer be the undisputed master of Norwegian waters. Allied convoys would have had an escort. The disaster of PQ-17 might not have happened, or might have happened differently. But here too, aviation. By 1943, British and Soviet pilots had learned to work much better. But German aviation at Norwegian airfields was still a serious force. Without reliable air cover, any battleship was vulnerable. Scenario 2 is the most interesting from a military standpoint. A Soviet battleship in the north could have truly changed the convoy situation, and thus accelerated Lend-Lease deliveries. This is a chain that leads to shortening the whole war. But the risks of losing the ship to aviation remained high. Now, Scenario 3, the coldest one. The Cold War. Sovetsky Soyuz versus Iowa. Suppose the impossible. Construction was finished after the war, already accounting for combat experience, with reinforced AA with new fire control systems. The ship enters service in 1946-47, and now it exists in a world where the main enemy is the USA. The Americans by this time have 4 Iowa-class battleships: Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, Wisconsin, plus over 20 aircraft carriers, plus nuclear weapons. Here's the question that renders all others moot. Why? In a world where the atomic bomb exists, the battleship ceases to be a strategic weapon. One plane with one bomb destroys what it takes a battleship hundreds of shells to hit. This is a new reality. And in this reality, the Sovetsky Soyuz, no matter how powerful, is an expensive target. The Americans realized this first. The construction program for the Montana class, 5 ships that were supposed to surpass everything existing, larger than the Yamato, more powerful than the Iowa, was canceled in 1943. Not because they lacked money, because it was clear. The future belonged to aircraft carriers and submarines. The Iowas stayed in service as fire support ships for shelling shore positions. They fought in Korea, in Vietnam, even in the Persian Gulf in 1991, but not as battleships in the classic sense, as floating batteries. The Sovetsky Soyuz in 1946 could have played the same role. Fire support for landing operations, psychological effect. An enormous ship with main battery guns makes an impression on any enemy, a symbol of naval power. But it would have remained just that, a symbol. Because Khrushchev was right about one thing: a missile is cheaper than a battleship. Much cheaper. And it kills just as well. This is what unites all 3 scenarios. In all 3, the Sovetsky Soyuz fights. In all 3, it makes an impression. In all 3, it shifts the balance of power in some way. But in none of the 3 does it become a weapon that decides the outcome of the war on its own. Because such a weapon, a battleship that decides the outcome alone, did not exist. Neither the Yamato, nor the Bismarck, nor the Tirpitz, nor the Iowa won the war alone. They were part of a system. And without that system, without aviation, without escort destroyers, without reconnaissance, without fuel, any battleship was just a very expensive and very large target. This is the main lesson of Project 23. It's not that they didn't finish the Sovetsky Soyuz. It's that the world changed faster than the ship could be built. And that was not a Soviet problem. It was a problem for all battleships in all countries. Because while the Sovetsky Soyuz was being built, the sky was filling with planes. And the sky won. December 10th, 1941, South China Sea, 90 miles off the coast of Malaya. Morning. The sky is overcast. The water surface is a calm swell. 2 British ships are steaming north. The Prince of Wales, the newest battleship in the British fleet, just recently completed, having participated in the hunt for the Bismarck a few months earlier. And the Repulse, a battle cruiser from the First World War, but powerful, fast, with a reputation as a reliable ship. They are steaming without air cover. The aircraft carrier that was supposed to accompany them ran aground before the mission. The commanding admiral, Tom Phillips, decided to go without it. He believed in the AA armament of his ships. He believed a battleship could hold its own. He was wrong. At 11:13, Japanese planes appeared over the horizon. 85 machines, torpedo bombers and horizontal bombers. Well-trained crews with the experience of Pearl Harbor, which had occurred 3 days earlier. The AA guns of both ships opened fire. The sky turned into a mass of shell bursts. Several Japanese planes fell into the sea, but the rest kept coming. The first torpedo hit the Repulse at 11:23, then another, and another. The Prince of Wales took a hit in the stern. The shaft was damaged, and the ship lost steering. The Japanese pilots noticed and concentrated on the stationary target. At 13:20, the Prince of Wales capsized and went under. 2 hours and 7 minutes. That is all the time it took for aviation to destroy 2 warships that had taken years to build and cost tens of millions of pounds. Churchill, upon receiving the news, wrote in his memoirs, "It was the heaviest blow he experienced during the entire war." Not because good ships had died, because it was finally clear the era was over. But the world did not accept this lesson immediately. The Imperial Japanese Navy was the last to accept it, because they had the Yamato. And as long as it existed, it seemed the battleship could still decide something. The Yamato is a separate story. The largest warship in human history, 72,000 tons, 460mm guns, the likes of which were found nowhere else. Armor so thick, the designers truly believed it could not be sunk by artillery fire. They might have been right. But no one sank the Yamato with artillery. April 1945. The war in the Pacific is coming to an end. The Americans are landing on Okinawa. The Japanese command makes a decision. Send the Yamato on a final raid, without fuel for a return trip, without air cover. Like a kamikaze ship, reach Okinawa, beach itself, and fire at American positions until the ammunition is gone. It was a gesture of despair, a farewell to an era. On April 7, 1945, American reconnaissance spotted the Yamato. Nearly 400 planes took off from carriers to intercept it. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. The Yamato opened AA fire. Its AA armament by then had been reinforced to over 150 guns of various calibers. The sky around it boiled with explosions. Several American planes fell into the sea, but the rest kept coming. The first torpedo hit at 12:37, then more and more. The American pilots worked methodically. They aimed primarily at the port side to create a list and rob the ship of maneuverability. 2 hours later, the Yamato listed 35 degrees. Then, a detonation of the ammunition magazines. A pillar of fire several kilometers high, visible from a distance of 160 kilometers. 3,657 men went to the bottom with the ship. American losses, 10 planes and 12 pilots. There it is, the mathematics of the new war. 3,000 crewmen against 12 pilots. Years of construction against a few hours of battle. The largest ship in history, and a few hundred planes that destroyed it. Everyone understood this math, almost at the same time. The Americans understood it earlier than others. In 1943, they canceled the Montana-class program. 5 ships that were to be the largest in the U.S. fleet. Larger than the Yamato, more powerful than the Iowa. The slipways were marked, the money allocated, the workers ready. The order came short. Cancel. Direct resources to aircraft carriers and landing ships. Because it was already clear. An aircraft carrier carrying 100 planes costs more to build, but it beats a battleship in any scenario. The range of aviation is hundreds of kilometers. The range of main battery guns is 40 to 50. An aircraft carrier strikes before the battleship even sees the enemy. This isn't just military tactics, it's a paradigm shift. A change in what sea power means. For 100 years, from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century, sea power meant armor and main battery guns. Dreadnoughts, super dreadnoughts, battleships. It was all the evolution of one idea. Put the biggest gun on a ship, protect it with the thickest armor, and bring it to the enemy shores. Aviation killed that idea. Not all at once. Gradually, starting in 1940 to 41, when Italian biplane torpedo bombers damaged several British battleships at Toronto, when the Japanese crushed Pearl Harbor from the air, when the Prince of Wales went to the bottom. By 1945, the idea was finally dead. But here's the strange thing. Battleships did not vanish immediately. The Iowa stayed in service with the American fleet for decades. The last time they fired was in 1991, in the Persian Gulf, shelling Iraqi positions with their main guns. Effectively, by the way. Against land targets, the battleship worked perfectly. No aviation can provide such a heavy and precise strike on coastal fortifications. But that was already a different role. Not the ruler of the seas. Not the center of the fleet's combat formation. A floating battery. Very expensive, very powerful, but auxiliary. The battleship became a support tool. The main weapons at sea became aircraft carriers and submarines. Submarines. Stop here for a second. Because this is where history makes one of its most unexpected turns. The turn that directly concerns our story. The factory built for battleships. The slipways designed for hulls weighing tens of thousands of tons. The cranes, capable of lifting sections weighing hundreds of tons. The engineers who learned to work with armor and complex machinery. All of it remained. It didn't go anywhere. And all of it found a use. Just not where anyone had planned. The sky defeated the battleships. No, the deep had other plans. The White Sea. Somewhere in the gray water lie the last fragments of the hull of the Sovetsky Soyuz. The missiles did their job. The scrap metal went for smelting. The great design dissolved in the cold water and factory smoke. It seemed like the end of the story. But let's go back to Severodvinsk, to the city that rose on the empty shore of the White Sea in 3 years, to the factory built for battleships that never built a battleship. Sevmash stands. The enormous docks haven't gone anywhere. The cranes, the same ones, modernized but on the same foundations. The workers, now a different generation, children and grandchildren of those who felled the forest and laid the first bricks in 36. The engineering school, created from zero for Project 23, it is alive. It was passed from master to apprentice through the war, through the blockade, through the post-war ruins. And in the late 1940s, a new order came to the plant. Not battleships, something else. The Soviet Union was beginning to build nuclear submarines. Think about the scale of that. A nuclear submarine is not just a big ship underwater. It is a nuclear reactor packed into a steel hull capable of withstanding the pressure at depths of several hundred meters. It is a weapon that can stay submerged for months, that carries ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads. That alone is capable of destroying an entire city. This required technologies that had never existed before. New grades of steel, stronger, more uniform, capable of withstanding the colossal pressure of the abyss. New welding methods, not a single microscopic seam through which water could seep under pressure. New cranes, new slipways, new tools. Sound familiar? It was the very engineers who learned to weld armor for battleships who are now welding the hulls of submarines. It was the very technologies for processing heavy steel developed for Project 23 that became the foundation for submarine shipbuilding. It was the very slipways built for 270-meter hulls that were now used to assemble submarines. The first Soviet nuclear submarine, the K-3 Leninsky Komsomol, entered service in 1958, built at Sevmash, at that very factory. Then came the K-19, then the Project 667 boats, the Soviet answer to the American Polaris. Then the Typhoon, the largest submarine in human history, 172 meters long, 23,000 tons displacement, 20 ballistic missiles on board, also built at Sevmash. And today, in the 21st century, Sevmash builds the Bore and Yasin-class nuclear submarines, the newest ships of the Russian fleet, the most modern submarines in the world by many standards. All of this is the legacy of a program that formally failed, because failure depends on how you count. If you count by ships, 0. Not a single battleship. 15 planned, 0 built. From that perspective, the Big Fleet program is one of the most expensive failures in the history of naval construction. But if you count differently, the program created a shipyard that builds the fleet to this day. It created an engineering school that has been passed down through generations. It created the technologies for processing heavy naval steel, without which Soviet nuclear submarines could not exist. It built a city. Severodvinsk today lives precisely because of Sevmash, precisely because of the industries that were laid down for Project 23. Stalin wanted dominance at sea. He did not get it in the way he planned, but the Soviet fleet got dominance anyway, just not on the surface, but under the water. Not with battleships, but with submarine missile carriers. The ambition found a different form, a different depth. Now, back to the beginning. Autumn 1941. Artillery thunders near Leningrad. The B-37 gun stands on a railway platform in the forest. The crew brings up a shell, a ton of steel and explosives. The commander looks at the map. the target is identified. This weapon was created for a naval battle, to hit armored enemy ships from 40 kilometers away. It never fired at a ship. It fired at German positions in the frozen earth of the Leningrad region. A few kilometers from the front line, in concrete bunkers, lies armor. Sheets of cemented steel, cut with blowtorches from the stock for the battleship. It stops bullets and shrapnel. It protects men who would otherwise have died. On the slipway of the Baltic plant stands the hull, covered by a camouflage net. Under the bombs, under the shells, it cannot fire. It cannot maneuver. It cannot protect itself. But it stands. And this is what I think about this ship. The Sovetsky Soyuz was never what it was planned to be. It didn't become a symbol of naval power. It didn't reach the open ocean. It didn't participate in great battles. It didn't have a crew that could take pride in it. But it fought. With its armor, in the Leningrad bunkers. With its gun, on the Neva front. With its shipyard, in the submarines that were built on its slipways for decades. With its engineers, who learned from its blueprints and then built entirely different ships. It was a ship that never became a ship. And yet, it fought longer than most ships that were ever built. There is one more thing I think about when I look at photos of that hull. At that enormous steel structure standing on a slipway in a besieged city. The people who built it knew that war was coming. They heard the reports. They read the papers. They understood there was no time. Everything was changing. The ship might not make it. And they kept working anyway. They laid the armored sheets. They welded the ribs. They installed the bulkheads. Not because they believed they would finish in time. Maybe. Because they couldn't not build. Because it was their work, their profession, their way of participating in what was happening. The ship fought without ever going to sea. And the factory builds the fleet to this day. I don't think it was a failure. I think it's just a story about how great designs rarely manifest the way they were planned. They go underwater. They change shape. They find a different purpose. They live in the walls of bunkers and in the hulls of submarines. Invisible, unnoticed, but real. The Sovetsky Soyuz did not become a battleship. It became something else. And that something else turned out to be more important.